March 4th, 1944, 29,000 feet above Brandenburg, Germany. Hauptmann Heinz Knoke of Jagdgeschwader 11 spotted the contrails first, long white streaks scratching across the crystal blue sky from the west. He keyed his radio transmission, expecting to report the usual formation of B-17 flying fortresses with their Thunderbolt escorts turning back at the German border as fuel tanks ran dry. But something was different this morning. Something that would change everything about the air war over Europe. The American fighters weren't turning back. They were still coming, driving deeper into the Reich than any single-engine escort had ever penetrated. Knoke's wingman, Lieutenant Werner Hohenberg, transmitted what every Luftwaffe pilot was thinking. Herr Hauptmann, those aren't Thunderbolts. Look at the wings. Look at the tails. What are those aircraft? The sleek silver fighters boring through German airspace at 400 miles per hour were North American P-51 Mustangs, and their arrival over Berlin that March morning marked the beginning of the end for the Luftwaffe's fighter force. Within 4 months, the transformation would be complete. The once dominant German fighter arm that had terrorized Allied bombers would be reduced to a broken force, bleeding experienced pilots faster than training schools could replace them, surrendering control of German skies to an enemy that could now reach anywhere, anytime, with overwhelming force. This is the story of how a single aircraft type paired with a simple technological innovation and employed with ruthless strategic clarity accomplished what 2 years of bombing campaigns had failed to achieve: the destruction of the Luftwaffe as an effective fighting force. It's a story of engineering excellence meeting operational necessity of tactical evolution driven by strategic imperative, and of how American industrial capacity, when properly focused, could produce weapons that didn't just match German technology but fundamentally altered the balance of power in ways that no amount of courage or tactical skill could overcome. The P-51 Mustang's journey to becoming the decisive weapon of the European air war began with an unlikely origin. In April 1940, the British Purchasing Commission approached North American aviation with an urgent request. Britain, standing alone against Nazi Germany, desperately needed modern fighters. The company's president, James Kindleberger, made an audacious proposal. Instead of building Curtiss P-40s under license as the British wanted, North American would design and build an entirely new fighter in just 120 days. The result was the NA-73X, which first flew on October 26, 1940. The aircraft that would become the P-51 Mustang incorporated advanced aerodynamics including a laminar flow wing, designed by engineer Edgar Schmutt. This wing design reduced drag dramatically, promising exceptional speed and range. But the original Mustang had a fatal flaw. Powered by the Allison V1710 engine, it performed superbly at low altitude but gasped for power above 15,000 feet, exactly where high-altitude bomber escort required maximum performance. The RAF, evaluating early Mustangs in 1942, recognized both the aircraft's potential and its limitation. In April 1942, Ronald Harker, a test pilot for Rolls-Royce, flew a Mustang at the RAF's Aircraft and Armament Experimental Establishment. His reaction was immediate. The airframe was exceptional, possibly the best he had ever flown, but the engine was entirely wrong for European combat. Harker proposed a solution that seemed obvious in hindsight but revolutionary at the time: install the Rolls-Royce Merlin engine, the same power plant that made the Spitfire formidable at altitude. The Merlin 61 engine featured a 2-stage, 2-speed supercharger that maintained power output up to 30,000 feet. When mated with the Mustang's low-drag airframe, the combination produced an aircraft that could fly higher, faster, and farther than anything in the sky. The first Merlin-powered Mustang flew on October 13, 1942. Test pilots reported performance that exceeded every expectation. Top speed reached 441 miles per hour at 29,800 feet. Service ceiling climbed to 41,900 feet. Most importantly, range with internal fuel alone exceeded 950 miles, nearly double that of the P-47 Thunderbolt. By December 1943, the first P-51B Mustangs began arriving in England, assigned to the 354th Fighter Group of the 9th Air Force. These early Mustangs carried 184 gallons of internal fuel in self-sealing tanks. But even this impressive fuel capacity wasn't sufficient for the mission that would define the Mustang's legacy, escorting heavy bombers to Berlin and back, a round trip of nearly 1,200 miles. The solution came from an unglamorous piece of technology that would prove as important as the Merlin engine itself: disposable external fuel tanks. Engineers had experimented with various drop tank designs throughout 1943, but manufacturing capacity and logistical challenges limited availability. The standard 75-gallon belly tank extended range significantly, but still fell short of Berlin. In early 1944, larger 108-gallon wing tanks became available, transforming the Mustang's strategic reach. With two 108-gallon wing tanks plus the 75-gallon belly tank, a P-51B carried 475 gallons of external fuel in addition to its 184-gallon internal capacity. Total fuel capacity reached 659 gallons, providing a combat radius exceeding 650 miles. For the first time in the European Air War, a high-performance fighter could escort bombers anywhere in Germany, engage in sustained combat, and return to England. The Luftwaffe, meanwhile, was already reeling from losses that its training infrastructure could not replace. By early 1944, German fighter pilot training had been reduced from the pre-war standard of 250 flight hours to barely 160 hours, with some pilots entering combat with less than 100 hours total flying time. Fuel shortages meant limited practice time. Ammunition rationing meant inadequate gunnery training. The veteran aces who had terrorized Allied bombers in 1943 were being killed faster than replacement pilots could learn even basic combat tactics. General der Jagdflieger, Adolf Galland, commander of all Luftwaffe fighter forces, understood the impossible mathematics his pilots faced. In January 1944, he reported to Reichsmarschall Hermann Göring that the Luftwaffe was losing experienced fighter pilots at a rate of 100 per month, while the training schools produced only 50 replacements. The deficit was unsustainable. But Galland's analysis failed to account for what was coming. The introduction of long-range escort fighters would accelerate pilot losses to catastrophic levels. The strategic bomber offensive against Germany had reached a crisis point by February 1944. The 8th Air Force, committed to daylight precision bombing, had suffered devastating losses in late 1943. The October 14th raid on Schweinfurt cost 60 bombers shot down and 138 damaged out of 291 dispatched, a loss rate exceeding 20%. Such casualties were unsustainable. Without effective fighter escort, the entire daylight bombing campaign faced potential cancellation. General Henry Arnold, commanding the United States Army Air Forces, and General Karl Spaatz, commanding United States Strategic Air Forces in Europe, recognized that the problem wasn't just protecting bombers, it was destroying the Luftwaffe fighter force. As long as German fighters could attack bomber formations with relative impunity, losses would remain unacceptable. The solution required more than just escort fighters. It required a fundamental shift in fighter tactics from defensive protection to offensive destruction. In January 1944, Spaatz appointed General James Doolittle to command the 8th Air Force. Doolittle, already a legend for leading the April 1942 raid on Tokyo, brought fresh thinking to the escort problem. His most important decision came within days of taking command. He changed fighter tactics from close escort, where fighters stayed rigidly with bomber formations, to free-ranging pursuit. Fighters would still protect bombers, but they were now authorized and encouraged to leave the formations to chase and destroy German fighters wherever they appeared. The implications were revolutionary. German pilots, accustomed to choosing when and how to engage, now faced American fighters that hunted them aggressively. The Luftwaffe couldn't simply wait for ideal attack opportunities. Every time German fighters assembled to attack bombers, American escorts would dive on them. The psychological impact on German pilots was immediate and profound. They went from hunters to hunted. The operational test of these new tactics and capabilities came during Big Week, February 20th through 25th, 1944. The 8th Air Force launched a series of maximum effort raids against German aircraft manufacturing facilities. The goal was straightforward: destroy the Luftwaffe in the air and on the ground by targeting both the fighters themselves and the factories that produced them. The offensive would demonstrate both the Mustang's capabilities and the effectiveness of aggressive escort tactics. February 20th, 1944. The first day of Big Week sent over 1,000 heavy bombers against targets including Leipzig, Brunswick, and various aircraft component factories. The P-51 Mustangs of the 357th Fighter Group, newly arrived in England, flew their first escort mission. The contrast with previous operations was immediate. For the first time, American fighters remained with bomber formations throughout their penetration into Germany. Hauptmann Walter Dahl of Jagdgeschwader. 3. A veteran with over 40 victories encountered the Mustangs during an attempted interception near Leipzig. His combat report reflected shock at the new situation. The American fighters were everywhere, not just protecting their bombers, but hunting us actively. We assembled to attack, and immediately the Silver Fighters were among us. They followed us through maneuvers. They shot down 3 of our aircraft before we could even engage the bombers. This is not escort, this is fighter superiority. The second day brought 900 bombers against targets including Brunswick and aircraft factories across central Germany. The weather deteriorated with heavy clouds, making formation flying difficult and navigation challenging. But the Mustangs pressed on, demonstrating not just range but operational flexibility. When German fighters attempted to exploit cloud cover to ambush bombers, the escorts were waiting. Lieutenant Hans Hartigs of Jagdgeschwader. One described the new tactical reality in a letter to his brother that passed through censors only because it arrived after his death. We can no longer choose our battles. The Americans force us to fight on their terms. If we attack their bombers, their escorts attack us. If we try to avoid combat to preserve strength, they chase us. They have fuel to hunt for hours. We have minutes before we must land or run dry. Every engagement costs us pilots we cannot replace. February 22nd saw the largest raid yet, with over 1,200 bombers attacking targets, including the Messerschmitt assembly plants at Regensburg and Gotha, along with ball-bearing facilities across Germany. The P-51 groups flew multiple escort legs, with early groups bringing bombers into Germany and relief groups taking over for the deepest penetrations before final groups covered withdrawal. For the first time, American fighters maintained continuous coverage throughout a mission lasting over 8 hours. The Luftwaffe threw everything available into the defense, launching over 700 fighter sorties. The resulting air battles stretched across hundreds of miles of German airspace. But the mathematics of attrition now favored the Americans decisively. German pilots faced not just numerical superiority, but technological and tactical disadvantages. The Mustangs could engage at high altitude where many German fighters struggled. They could maintain combat longer thanks to superior fuel capacity. Most importantly, their pilots arrived with hundreds of hours of training, while German replacements arrived with barely enough experience to take off and land. Major James Howard, of the 354th Fighter Group, demonstrated the Mustang's combat effectiveness during the January 11th mission to Oskersleben before Big Week began. When German fighters swarmed his bomber formation and his squadron mates were scattered by combat, Howard single-handedly defended the bombers for over 30 minutes, shooting down several German fighters and damaging others. His actions earned him the Medal of Honor and provided a preview of what aggressive, well-trained pilots in superior aircraft could achieve. The climactic day of Big Week came on February 25th, when over 1,300 bombers struck Regensburg, Augsburg, Stuttgart and other targets. The 8th Air Force committed virtually every available bomber and fighter. The P-51 groups flew extended missions that pushed even their impressive range to the limits, but they maintained coverage, providing the bombers with protection that had seemed impossible just months earlier. The results of Big Week demonstrated both the strategic vision and its cost. The 8th Air Force lost 226 bombers during the 6 days, along with 28 fighters. Over 2,600 airmen were killed, captured or missing. The loss rate of 6.4% was serious but sustainable, far below the catastrophic rates of late 1943. German aircraft production actually increased in subsequent months thanks to dispersal of manufacturing and improved organization. But the Luftwaffe suffered a loss that could not be replaced: pilots. During Big Week, the Luftwaffe lost approximately 355 aircraft destroyed in combat, with hundreds more damaged. More critically, they lost nearly 100 pilots killed and dozens more seriously wounded. These men represented the irreplaceable core of experienced fighter leaders. Major Egon Meyer, one of Germany's top aces and a specialist in bomber attack tactics, was killed on February 2nd. Hauptmann Hans Joachim Jabs, another ace, was badly wounded. Squadron and flight leaders who understood how to coordinate attacks on bomber formations were being killed at rates that made tactical knowledge nearly impossible to preserve. The psychological impact on surviving Luftwaffe pilots was equally devastating. Lieutenant Heinz Knoke, who had survived the war as an ace, recorded in his diary the changing nature of combat. In 1943, we feared the bombers' defensive fire but controlled when and how we engaged. By March 1944, we feared the American fighters more than the bombers. They were faster, more maneuverable at altitude, and far more aggressive than the Thunderbolts. Every mission became a struggle for survival rather than an opportunity to stop the bombers. But Big Week was merely the prelude. The real test of the Mustang's strategic impact would come with the Berlin raids, where the deepest possible penetration into Germany would demonstrate once and for all that no target was beyond American reach. General Doolittle and his staff planned the first Berlin mission carefully. The symbolic importance of hitting the German capital was obvious. The operational importance was even greater. Forcing the Luftwaffe to defend Berlin would compel them to commit their remaining strength. The resulting air battle would either validate the investment in long-range fighters or demonstrate that even the Mustang couldn't provide adequate protection at such distances. March 3rd, 1944. The 8th Air Force briefing rooms filled with crews learning they would attack Berlin the next day. The target was the Erkner Ball bearing works and various industrial facilities in and around the capital. But everyone understood the real objective. This mission was about proving it could be done, about demonstrating that American air power could reach anywhere in the Third Reich. The planning was meticulous. Multiple fighter groups would provide escort in carefully coordinated legs. The 4th and 357th Fighter Groups would escort the bombers on the initial penetration. The 354th and 363rd Groups would relieve them over central Germany. The deepest escort, covering the actual attack on Berlin, would be provided by the 4th Fighter Group, returning after refueling, and the newly arrived 357th Fighter Group. It represented the most complex fighter escort operation yet attempted. March 4th, 1944 dawned with acceptable weather over England, but uncertain conditions over the continent. At air bases across East Anglia, over 500 heavy bombers prepared for takeoff. At Debden, Leiston, and other fighter stations, P-51 pilots attended their final briefings. Captain Don Gentile of the 4th Fighter Group later recalled the mood. "We knew this was historic. Berlin had never been hit by American daylight bombers. The brass made clear that getting there mattered more than what we hit. Proving we could do it would change everything." The bomber stream stretched for miles as it crossed the English coast shortly after 10 a.m. The initial escort fighters took up their positions, flying high and offset from the bombers to maximize their ability to dive on any attackers. The formation penetrated German airspace without major incident. German radar tracked the massive raid from the moment it crossed the coast, but Luftwaffe controllers faced an impossible decision: commit fighters early and risk exhausting fuel before the bombers reached their target, or wait and allow the Americans deeper penetration than ever before. They waited, hoping to conserve strength for a coordinated attack as the bombers approached Berlin. But this played directly into American hands. The phased escort meant fresh fighters arrived just as German interceptors finally committed to battle. Near Magdeburg, approximately 100 miles from Berlin, German fighters from multiple Geschwader assembled for a mass attack. Hauptmann Klaus Mietusch led elements of Jagdgeschwader 26, including some of the Luftwaffe's most experienced pilots. They climbed toward the bomber formation, preparing for their red attack runs. The P-51S of the 357th Fighter Group, flying high cover, spotted the German formation assembling. Major Thomas Hayes led his squadron in a diving attack that scattered the Germans before they could coordinate their assault. The engagement dissolved into individual dogfights spread across miles of sky. Captain Richard Peterson shot down 2 Focke-Wulf 190s in quick succession. Lieutenant Robert Goodnight pursued a Messerschmitt 109 to the deck, destroying it with a single burst that set the German fighter ablaze. But the significance wasn't just the kills. It was that American fighters were engaging German interceptors 100 miles from Berlin, preventing them from ever reaching the bombers. The Luftwaffe's careful plan to mass their forces dissolved into desperate defensive combat. Pilots who should have been making coordinated attacks on bombers instead fought for their lives against escorts that refused to let them disengage. The bombers continued toward Berlin virtually unmolested. At 12:15 p.m., the lead formations reached the German capital. Through broken clouds, crews could see the city that Hitler had promised would never be bombed in daylight. The bombardiers released their loads on the Erkner facility and other targets of opportunity. The bombing was scattered due to cloud cover, but the symbolic impact was immense. American bombers had struck Berlin in daylight, and they had done so with acceptable losses. The withdrawal proved as dangerous as the penetration. German fighters that had been held in reserve now launched desperate attacks. Near Brandenburg, Oberleutnant Robert Weiss led a Gruppe of Messerschmitt 109s against the bomber stream. But again, the P-51s were there. Captain Don Gentile and his wingman intercepted Weiss's formation, shooting down 3 fighters before the Germans could engage. Weiss himself barely escaped, his aircraft damaged by machine gun fire that shredded his wing route. The mission statistics told a story of qualified success. Out of 502 bombers dispatched, 11 were lost to flak and fighters, a loss rate of 2.2%. The 8th Air Force could sustain such losses indefinitely. 5 P-51s were shot down, but 4 pilots were recovered. The Luftwaffe lost 66 fighters destroyed and dozens damaged. More critically, they lost 17 pilots killed and 8 wounded, a rate of attrition that was mathematically unsustainable. But one raid didn't break the Luftwaffe. The second Berlin mission, launched on March 6th, would prove even more decisive. This time the weather was perfect, allowing maximum bomb loads and optimal flying conditions. The target selection was secondary. The real objective remained engaging and destroying German fighter strength. Over 700 bombers attacked Berlin and targets across eastern Germany, escorted by every available P-51 group. The Luftwaffe response was massive and desperate. Recognizing they couldn't allow Berlin to be bombed with impunity, German fighter controllers committed virtually every available unit. Over 500 fighter sorties launched against the American formation. The resulting air battle became one of the largest of the European war, with combat stretching from the Dutch coast to Brandenburg. Major James Howard, already a Medal of Honor recipient, led his squadron in a series of engagements that demonstrated both Mustang superiority and proper tactics. His after-action report captured the nature of the combat. We encountered approximately 40 enemy fighters assembling at 25,000 feet near Dummer Lake. I led the squadron in a diving attack that broke up their formation. In the subsequent engagement lasting approximately 20 minutes, we destroyed 11 enemy aircraft confirmed with 4 probable. We did not lose a single aircraft. The enemy attempted to disengage, but we maintained pursuit until they scattered individually. The phrase maintained pursuit captured the transformation in fighter tactics. In 1943, American escorts might have broken off after the initial pass, returning to protect the bombers. Now they pursued German fighters relentlessly, preventing them from reforming for renewed attacks. The Mustang's superior range meant pilots could spend fuel on extended combat without risking the inability to return home. The March 6th mission cost the 8th Air Force 69 bombers, the highest loss of any Berlin raid. But the context revealed the changing balance of power. The Luftwaffe had committed maximum strength and achieved these results only through this sacrifice of irreplaceable pilots and aircraft. American losses, while serious, were being replaced. Training schools graduated new pilots every week. Factory production lines delivered new bombers and fighters in quantities that exceeded losses. The mathematics of attrition favored the side with deeper resources and better logistics. German pilot losses on March 6th exceeded 80 killed or missing, with dozens more wounded. Among the dead was Hauptmann Klaus Miertusch, a respected ace and tactician. Oberleutnant Rudolf Zwesken, another experienced pilot, was killed when his damaged aircraft crashed attempting an emergency landing. These losses couldn't be absorbed. Each dead squadron leader represented years of training and combat experience. Replacement pilots arriving with 100 hours of flight time couldn't possibly fill such gaps. The Berlin missions continued through March with raids on the 8th, 9th, and 22nd. Each followed the same pattern: massive bomber formations escorted by P-51 SA engaging German fighters across hundreds of miles. The cumulative effect was catastrophic for the Luftwaffe. By the end of March, German fighter strength in the West had declined from approximately 1,100 available aircraft to fewer than 800. Pilot losses exceeded 400 killed or seriously wounded during March alone. The training schools, already producing barely adequate replacements, couldn't keep pace. Hauptmann Heinz Knoke, commanding an air defense unit, recorded the growing desperation in his diary entries throughout March. Each mission brings new losses we cannot afford. Today we lost 5 pilots from my staffel. 2 were killed, 3 bailed out wounded. Only 1 of the dead was experienced, but even the replacements are irreplaceable now. We receive new pilots who have never fired their guns at a moving target, never practiced high-altitude combat, never learned how to coordinate attacks. They are brave but doomed. The impact extended beyond simple attrition. German fighter tactics, developed over years of combat, required experienced leaders who understood how to coordinate attacks on bomber formations. The standard tactic involved assembling large formations, approaching from the front to minimize exposure to defensive fire, and making coordinated passes that overwhelmed protective escorts. But these tactics required split-second timing, radio discipline, and experienced flight leaders. As those leaders died, the tactics deteriorated. By April 1944, German fighter units increasingly attacked in small groups or individually, abandoning the coordinated assaults that had been so effective in 1943. Inexperienced pilots simply lacked the skill to execute complex maneuvers while under attack from aggressive escorts. The degradation of tactical effectiveness multiplied the impact of numerical losses. Not only were there fewer German fighters, but those remaining were less effective than their predecessors. The psychological dimension of the Mustang's impact cannot be overstated. German pilots developed what they called Jagdschreck, fighter terror, a recognition that American escorts could appear anywhere and couldn't be shaken. Lieutenant Wolfgang Fischer, shot down over Berlin on March 22nd and captured, told interrogators about the changing psychology. In 1943, we feared the bombers' defensive fire but controlled our tactics. By 1944, we feared the Silver fighters more than anything. You couldn't escape them. They were faster in level flight. They could outclimb us above 20,000 feet, and they had fuel to chase us anywhere. Even if you survived combat, you knew the next mission would bring the same impossible odds. The strategic implications became clear to German leadership. In April 1944, Adolf Galland presented Göring with an analysis that predicted the complete destruction of the German fighter force within months if current attrition rates continued. He proposed shifting to a defensive strategy that avoided combat, except under ideal circumstances. Göring rejected the proposal, insisting that fighters must continue defending German cities regardless of cost. The Reich's propaganda position required visible defense, even if that defense was being systematically destroyed. Meanwhile, Allied air superiority enabled increasingly aggressive tactics. P-51 pilots were encouraged to strafe German airfields on their return flights, destroying aircraft on the ground and further multiplying pressure on the Luftwaffe. On April 5th, the 357th Fighter Group strafed 6 airfields during a single mission, claiming 58 German aircraft destroyed on the ground. Even allowing for overclaiming common in strafing attacks, the impact was significant. Aircraft destroyed on the ground couldn't be replaced faster than those lost in combat. The introduction of the P-51D model in May 1944 provided further advantages. This variant featured a bubble canopy that improved visibility, addressing one of the few weaknesses of earlier models. It also carried 6 50 caliber machine guns instead of 4, providing even more firepower. Most significantly, production ramped up dramatically. North American Aviation's factories in California and Texas produced over 2,000 P-51Ds during the summer of 1944, ensuring that losses could be replaced immediately. By June 1944, the transformation of air superiority was complete. The Luftwaffe no longer contested daylight skies over Germany, except sporadically. Fighter units were pulled back to defend against the invasion of France, where they were slaughtered by overwhelming Allied air superiority. The bomber offensive continued with loss rates below 2%, a level that would have seemed impossible just 6 months earlier. The statistics document the destruction of the Luftwaffe as a viable fighting force. In January 1944, the Luftwaffe had approximately 1,650 single-engine fighters assigned to the defense of the Reich, with roughly 1,100 operationally ready. By July 1944, despite increased production that delivered over 3,000 new fighters during those 6 months, operational strength had declined to approximately 600 aircraft. The difference represented losses that exceeded production by 50%. But aircraft could be replaced. Pilots could not. German fighter pilot losses from January through June 1944 exceeded 2,300 killed, missing, or seriously wounded. This represented nearly 100% turnover of the entire fighter force in just 6 months. Experienced aces still achieved victories, but they were being killed at rates that ensured their expertise died with them. Oberleutnant Anton Haeckel, one of Germany's top aces with over 150 victories, survived until war's end largely through exceptional skill and growing caution. His memoir recorded that by mid-1944, most of his fellow aces from 1943 were dead. Those who survived learned to avoid combat unless circumstances heavily favoured success. The impact on bomber losses validated the strategic logic behind long-range escort. In the 6 months before the P-51 arrived in significant numbers, from July through December 1943, the 8th Air Force lost 1,028 heavy bombers, an average loss rate exceeding 8% per mission. In the 6 months after the Mustang established air superiority, from January through June 1944, losses declined to 1,382 bombers, despite flying far more missions. The loss rate dropped below 3%. Bomber crews had a statistically reasonable chance of completing their 25 mission tours. The bombing campaign continued with increasing effectiveness. The human cost behind these statistics reflected tragedy on both sides. Each bomber lost represented 10 young men killed, captured, or wounded. Each German fighter shot down was a pilot who had likely survived dozens of missions, only to fall to an American who might have been flying his first combat sortie. War is measurement of human lives in statistical abstractions that mask individual stories of courage, fear, and loss. But the strategic reality remained clear. The P-51 Mustang, combined with drop tanks, aggressive tactics, and numerical superiority, had accomplished what 2 years of bombing campaigns had failed to achieve. The Luftwaffe fighter force was broken, not through attrition of aircraft, but through destruction of the irreplaceable human expertise required to operate effectively. By the time of the Normandy invasion in June 1944, Allied air forces flew where they wished over France with minimal opposition. The thousands of German fighters theoretically available couldn't be effectively employed, because the pilots lacked training and the tactical leadership had been decimated. The transformation took less than 6 months. In December 1943, the Luftwaffe was still a formidable force that inflicted unacceptable losses on daylight bomber formations. By June 1944, German fighter pilots flew only when ordered and avoided combat when possible, knowing that engagement likely meant death against superior numbers of better-trained pilots in equal or superior aircraft. The Silver Mustangs over Berlin had accomplished more than symbolic victory. They had broken the enemy's will and capacity to resist in their own skies. The lessons extended beyond World War II. The Mustang demonstrated that technological superiority, when combined with operational flexibility and strategic clarity, could achieve decisive results. Range, enabled by drop tanks, proved as important as speed or firepower. Aggressive tactics that hunted enemy fighters rather than passively protecting bombers multiplied effectiveness. Training that produced 400-hour pilots created advantages that German pilots with 100 hours couldn't overcome regardless of courage or determination. The P-51 remained in service through the Korean War, proving that its design excellence extended beyond its original mission. But its greatest legacy was strategic. It proved that air superiority, once achieved, enabled everything else. The Normandy invasion succeeded partly because Allied aircraft dominated the skies. preventing German reinforcement and resupply. The advance across France proceeded with close air support that German forces couldn't match. The final assault into Germany faced a Luftwaffe that existed primarily on paper, unable to contest Allied air dominance. The destruction of the Luftwaffe over Berlin in spring 1944 stands as one of the decisive campaigns of World War II, accomplished not through a single dramatic battle but through systematic attrition that broke an enemy force through the mathematics of unsustainable loss. The P-51 Mustang provided the tool, American industrial capacity provided the numbers, strategic clarity provided the vision. Together they achieved what had seemed impossible just months earlier: complete air superiority over the heart of Nazi Germany. The pilots who flew those Berlin missions, both American and German, displayed courage worthy of respect regardless of cause. But courage couldn't overcome the fundamental disparity in resources, training, and strategic position. The Americans arrived over Berlin with full tanks, hundreds of hours of training, and the confidence of numerical superiority. The Germans defended with barely adequate fuel, minimal training, and the knowledge that survival was increasingly a matter of luck rather than skill. The outcome was predetermined once the P-51 demonstrated it could reach Berlin. Everything afterward was simply the working out of inevitable mathematics. The story of how P-51 Mustangs over Berlin crushed the Luftwaffe is ultimately a story about industrial warfare meeting strategic necessity. America built an aircraft that combined range, performance, and reliability in unprecedented measure. Leaders employed it aggressively rather than defensively. Pilots flew it with skill earned through extensive training. The result was air superiority so complete that historians mark it as the turning point when Allied victory became not just possible but inevitable. The Silver fighters that German pilots first spotted over Brandenburg in March 1944 carried more than machine guns and drop tanks. They carried the future, and that future belonged entirely to the Allies.